Welcome to We Need to Talk About Farming, a new spin-off series from myself, Will Evans, and the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. There is a lot of noise in farming right now, and for many, the future feels uncertain. This series is about having better conversations about the biggest issues facing agriculture. In each episode, we'll take on a topic that's making headlines and dividing social media and WhatsApp groups. We'll go beyond the buzzwords, cut through the cliches, and work out what really matters. In this episode, we are talking about meat and dairy. Calls to cut livestock numbers and eat less milk and meat have become hugely controversial. Beef, lamb, and milk are at the heart of Britain's farming heritage, particularly in the north and west. But consuming a bit less meat and dairy is seen as being central to all credible plans for helping the UK fight climate change and embrace healthier lifestyles. How do we strike the right balance? I'm joined by Ruth Grice and Jonny Blair. Ruth is a dairy farmer from Leicestershire, where she runs a herd of pedigree Holsteins in partnership with her parents. The milk goes to the Stilton making cooperative Long Clawson Dairy, where Ruth also works as farm liaison and sustainability manager. She's also a Nuffield scholar, and her report explored how dairy farmers and environmental organisations can work better together. Jonny farms outside Ballykelly in the northwest of Northern Ireland, using regenerative principles to improve his family farm's profit and biodiversity. He runs a suckler herd and sells the progeny as stores and finished cattle. He spoke last year at Fields Good, the first edition of Northern Ireland's new regenerative farming festival. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us. Okay,
Thank you.
big question to start with. We'll go to you first, Ruth. Why are reducing livestock numbers and consumption of red meat and dairy seen as being so important to meeting Britain's climate and nature goals?
I think if we take the emotion out of things and just look at the facts, there's no escaping the realization that, or the reality that the cattle, dairy cattle, in the instance of the sector I work in, both on the family farm and at Clawson, they contribute to our climate crisis. They have a role to play in that. So they contribute to the three major greenhouse gases. And yes, while agriculture only contributed 12%, roughly thereabouts, of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions in 2022, they made up for the lion's share of nitrous oxide, one of the three greenhouse gases, and methane is a huge greenhouse gas coming from the dairy sector. That made up 49% of the UK's methane emissions from cattle. So there's no escaping those facts. There are also other pressures that the dairy sector particularly brings to the climate change crisis. So land use pressures. Anyone that's had an aerial shot of our country recently, flying in coming back from holidays. The UK is a very busy country. We squeeze a lot of things into our land area, and agriculture takes up a huge percentage of that, around 70% of land. So, and a lot of that from the dairy sector is used for grazing livestock. And then lastly, again, just looking at the facts, there are huge impacts to biodiversity, to wildlife habitats from the dairy sector. So just one small example, thinking back to when my grandfather was farming, our winter forage for our dairy cows at home came from hay meadows. They were harvested later in the summer season, and harvested in a very slow manner as well. Gave wildlife a chance to thrive during the spring, summer, and move out the way when it was being harvested. But today, on a family farm, like so many of us around the UK, our winter fodder is silage, fermented grass, that's harvested much earlier in the season, from May onwards, in a much quicker fashion that doesn't really leave much time for wildlife to do their thing, and also to get out the way, frankly, of the machines as they come roaring through. So I don't think we can't escape the fact that we do have an impact, and obviously reducing numbers can be seen as a quick way to reduce those impacts.
Oh, okay. Um, Jonny, British meat and dairy is largely grown to internationally high welfare and environmental standards. It's something that we pride ourselves on. Our exports are seen as premium products. So, why, as a farmer, and we're all farmers, why should farmers have to change what we do?
Um, well, I suppose it's incredibly multifaceted, isn't it? It's a big question, and it's not just going down one route of why we need to change. But I think if you look in the wider social economic sort of state of our country, um, it's starting to put strain on the food system. And I think the food system is starting to put strain on people's health, and it's putting strain on the environmental health of the biodiversity that we're losing. And indeed, when it comes to the climate crisis, the ability to react and to keep your head above the water, so to speak, is starting to really show its head. Um, I think farmers have to acknowledge that times change. Farmers have to acknowledge that things change, that the way we do things can't always be the same, because you have to be able to react to what's coming down the road. You can't sort of stick your head in the sand and just say it'll be all right, sure, next year it'll be different. Um, you have to be able to acknowledge where you are, where you're going, where you need to be, and how you need to get there. And I think, yes, historically, it's largely grown to international high welfare and environmental standards. But I'd say there's a more of a creep in of willingness to lower standards in order to try and um, drive the yield. And I think that has to be called out. I come from a country where it's a very small land area, but there's a huge amount of meat and dairy export comes out of it. Um, and there's always been an argument that we need to feed the world and we have a responsibility as a farmer to feed the world.
Mm.
I personally don't see it like that. I personally see it that I have a responsibility first and foremost to feed my family, to provide a um, a life which is worthy of living, which a lot of farmers I think struggle with, because a lot of farmers do spend just every single waking minute of the day in their work, and I think that has to be called out. The I think it's just unsustainable where the current trajectory of the system is. Um, and there's a big talk about sustainability. It's a bit of a buzzword, but there's very little point in sustaining something that's slowly failing and and not working. So that's a bit of a roundabout answer to it, I suppose.
No, it's right. Why do they? I mean, you've kind of illustrated quite well. Why do these conversations feel so hard in different parts of the country, particularly in the likes of North and West England, Wales, Scotland, and over there in Northern Ireland, Johnny? I mean, it's just so central to our culture, I suppose, isn't it? Livestock farming.
Yeah, and I suppose it's farming itself has become polarized because I mean 50, 60, 70 years ago it was much more of a mixed landscape. Whereas now there are certain areas that are, for instance, there's certain parts of the country it's dairy farming much better. Certain parts of the country it's beef farming, sheep farming, and especially here in Northern Ireland, there's only a tiny percentage of the landmass which is really ideal for fruits and veg. So these all get sort of siloed together, and then they sort of start mudslinging out of those houses. And it's a wee bit like, well, hang on a wee minute, we're in here because of a system that has forced us to get big, get out, focus on the one thing that maybe makes the most money. It doesn't really take into account the holistic sort of, well, hang on a wee minute, if something's not great one year, I have another enterprise that can pick up the pan. So we've ended up sort of, it's hard to know if you could ever blame fault for anybody, but you ended up in a situation where we just have a huge polarization, even within farming, of the enterprises that are actually happening. And I think whenever people start to get questioned about that, they feel it's a personal attack because
Mm.
it's sort of come down to them. That's how they've been not forced, but how they've been coerced into the best way possible to make an efficient business that can make you money. Um, but whenever it doesn't start to make money, it's got a weird sort of effect. It can almost tighten that a wee bit more. Whenever people struggle in the farm, it almost makes them zero in on themselves and try and focus down on that without looking outside of the fence. It's almost like build the fence higher.
Mm.
And that I think that's possibly where it comes down to because I mean we all know that the margins within farming are traditionally poor, and that is probably seen as a reason, weirdly, as a reason to keep doing the same thing. Because how can you look at something else which is going to make me more money? It's not possible. You know, you get yourself into a mindset where it's just not possible to look outside of what you are doing. And it's incredibly difficult to change the 6 inches between your ears. That's the hardest thing, really, isn't it? Like?
For sure.
So,
Yeah. Ruth, why does that suggestion of reducing livestock numbers and consumption of meat and dairy, why does it get so heated so quickly? I mean, you do see it all the time. Don't you?
Mm.
Soon as there's something in the news about this, the Climate Change Committee says numbers need to fall to meet targets, or a county council or something will start offering only vegan options, and people get really, really angry and upset about it, don't they? Why do you think that is?
I think there are different layers to it. I think building on what Jonny was just saying then, there's a lot of finger pointing. Shame is used a lot, often in those conversations, and nobody likes being shamed into action. It's not very effective.
Mm.
It corners people, it disempowers them. So I think that's one level. I think the second part of that is that um, maybe not with the sustainability word in mind, but we have come an awful long way as an industry over the past 30 years. So if we think back to 1990, and how many cattle we had in the UK back then, we had around just over 12 million in total. That's reduced down to 9.2 million between then and the latest months of last year in 2024. So that's a 23% decrease, but from a dairy perspective, milk volumes have gone up. So just looking at sort of the efficiencies that we've already gained in our industry, which have had a really positive impact on our carbon emissions as well. We're doing more with less. It almost feels like, we're trying to do our best. Admittedly, that is a broad brush statement to make, but I feel together we are already making progress, and it just feels like, we're getting there. It will take time, and yet you've got this finger pointing going on that wants immediate answers, and answers can't be
Yeah.
given immediately. But I think going more to a personal level, um, I feel it really gets to me like a bit of a salt in the wound. Because when I know I wasn't around when my grandfather and my great grandfather were farming, but if I think back to what life must have been like for them on the family farm in the 1930s, that's kind of, if I'm honest, I'd love to have that. I'd love to have like a small mixed farm. Just last night, Dad was reflecting on when we had 40 cows and what the shed we were standing in used to do, how it was purposed. That sounds great. But farmers have got to operate in a system, and we have done as a family, and as have many other farming families across the UK. Um, you've got to be a profitable business to stay in business. We all know that. And sometimes you have to make decisions that kind of go against what your true beliefs and values are. I doubt many farmers willingly taking the finances out of the equation, but willingly took hedgerows out of their fields that had been there for, donkey's years, or took a plough to their wildflower meadows. Some decisions like that were to stay in business to become more profitable. And I think
Mm.
sometimes those systems that we operate in as farmers can trap us. And then when that finger pointing happens, and there's no context behind it, it just feels really unfair. And
Yeah.
you don't feel like you're given an opportunity to have a fair say. It just feels like, whatever response I give is going to sound really defensive and it's not going to come off well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I mean, I'm obviously I live in Wales and I went to the Royal Welsh Show in July, and it's always just a reminder of how central livestock farming is in this part of the world, and we're very proud of that. And when you walk around and you see all the kids with the animals, and it's a big thing, and the Welsh language was arguably kept alive by um, upland farmers in Wales. When it was at its lowest point in the 19th century. So it's very, very important to us, livestock farming, isn't it? It really is a motive subject, and it's difficult to have therefore these conversations, isn't it? And it'll be the same in the parts of the country where you live as well, I'm sure, guys. Um, how do we diffuse the tension then when this debate is often so polarized between, we've got farmers, I'm talking about it there, how much I love my community, and then you've got, I guess, at the extreme end, people who would like to see the end of livestock farming, animal rights activists and vegan activists and things. How do we diffuse that tension and move forward in a constructive way, Ruth?
I feel for me, with my individual farming hat on, I think that can just feel really overwhelming. Even if you are a fantastic communicator, let's say you've got a really active social media account, you're really good at sharing the farming story, that's a lot of weight to put on you as an individual. I feel that the whole supply chain has a role that they can play in those conversations. So the example you mentioned at the start of this conversation about universities deciding to go pure vegan for their menus, say if that did cause offence in the wrong way to anyone in the farming sector, we need to work together on this. There's a role that we here at Long Clawson Dairy we can play. We're in the supply chain. We are a cooperative of 31 local farmers in Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire, and we've perhaps got more capacity to have those meetings. And I think the ultimate goal in having those discussions would be to enter them where you can leave your differences at the front door. You can have respectable conversations without judgment, agree to disagree, but most importantly, find that common ground that you have between you. And I think that's the biggest thing when I did my Nuffield looking at how environmental organisations could work better with dairy farmers. A lot of it boiled down to that. Forget everything we don't agree on, but what do
Mm.
we both do, and how can we build on that? And sometimes it might be that you have to ultimately agree to disagree, but wouldn't it be lovely if those conversations happened in a really productive, respectful forum, as opposed to a lot of shouting and finger pointing in a very public way that sometimes doesn't really feel like the farming community is given an opportunity to say our piece because the horse is already bolted essentially.
Mm, yeah. Johnny, have you got anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the disconnect between the general public and where their food comes from has never been worse. It's never been wider. Um, and I think it has to come down to a level of education. And I think farmers have to be willing to open the doors to let people come in and have a look around who otherwise probably would never have the opportunity to go and see a farm. Because, I mean, if you grow up in a situation where you never see a cow in a field, where you never see any sort of farming activity, you're going to be at risk of just joining one side completely out of ignorance of the debate because you aren't going to have the opportunity to see the value of where your food comes from. And just sort of a funny little segue, we were just home from France there on holiday this week past, and it's quite interesting whenever you walk into a French supermarket. Not that I'm condoning supermarkets as the way forward, but The French supermarket and a British supermarket is quite different
Mm.
because the the amount of space dedicated, and these are huge buildings, the amount of space dedicated to fresh fruit, whether that be fish, poultry, well, not so much poultry, fish, meat, and fruits and vegetables is a huge part of the store, huge part of the store. And then your sort of your more processed foods have a much smaller area, and it's not as popular, shall we say? Whereas it's nearly the other way around here.
Yeah.
And I think that is sort of an underlying tale of where society has gone in the UK at the minute. It's people's disconnect from the food is showing in how they're eating their food and what they're eating and how they're spending their money. And I think it has to come down to education. Have to get people onto farms, and I'm not just meaning sort of through open farm weekends or things like that. There, I mean actively go to your children's school and invite, go to the principal, invite a class of whatever year olds to come out and actually have a look around, see what's happening, and it's not, shall we say, filtered to suit um, an open farm weekend, if that makes sense. It's actually suited to show you all the nuts and bolts of how a farm works and operates, and just put it across of how it is. And you should be, as a farmer, I think, willing to do that. If you're not willing to do that, I think that maybe puts a question mark on your own production system and how you're doing it. Are you completely comfortable with it if you don't want other people to have a look around and see? Um, and that's just purely to try and break down those barriers of on both sides of ignorance, because it's not just one side who's completely ignorant of the other. Both sides need to come together to find, as Ruth said, that common ground, because there's plenty of it.
Yeah.
I mean, we all live on the same ground, so we have to have plenty of it. And I probably imagine that there's actually more we agree on than we disagree on,
Mm.
but it's just so polarized that you can't actually find that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely agree. Ruth, just going in a slightly different direction. As you mentioned earlier, methane is the main source of emissions associated with livestock. As a dairy farmer, what was your reaction to the outcry about Arla's Bovaer trial last year? And what are your attitudes towards the role of methane suppressing feed additives in general going forward?
I understand why um, members of the general public reacted in the way they did. I think a lot of people felt that the Bovaer trial was a trial on humans, which was definitely not the case. And it made me really sad actually to see um, parties within the dairy supply chain turn on each other and distance themselves from Arla, when actually Arla have a fantastic sustainability program. They really are leaders in that area. We look to them a lot to see, what are they doing, what's working, what's not. This is an area of our work where we've got so much to learn from each other. So yeah, very disappointing to see finger pointing from within our sector last year over that. I think ultimately, we've got a huge challenge on our hands. So here at Clawson Dairy, um, we have got a target to reduce our emissions by 30% by 2032. Starting point was 2022. So at the moment, on average, our farms use 1.08 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent for every kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. To get out to our target, we've got to reduce that down to 0.76 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. That just isn't possible at the moment.
Mm.
We're working with real experts in the field at Map of Ag, and they're also telling us the same thing. So there'll be a point where we can reduce that down so much with efficiencies or with capital investments, but we then need a layer of scientific interventions, and one of those will be a methane inhibitor as a feed additive. If it works, all the trials show that it reduced methane by 30% and overall emissions by 12%. That's massive. That's a real game changer. It might be that between now and when conversations in the industry come back to looking at feed additives, that there might be other ways that our sector can make those really big gains. But there aren't many options on the table. Business efficiencies, of course, everyone wants to achieve that because, hey, they help your bottom line as well as your sustainability credentials, which is great. Capital investments, if you're looking at how you manage your organic manures, well, that involves cost. That involves potentially buying a new slurry spreader, so you're spreading it in a more efficient way. Well, we all know what's happened over the past few months with grants from DEFRA. They might be going one way, unfortunately, in the years to come. So, where are we going to make these gains if we don't look at the likes of both air in the future?
Yeah. What's your opinion on it, Jonny? Do you agree, or do you have a different view on that?
Uh, I would. I'm not a fan of methane inhibitors purely from the fact that I'm a big believer in unintended consequences.
Mm.
So I am a big believer that yes, if you look at a single metric, it may well do quite well on that, but that's not to say that over the course of the metrics are valuable to the sustainability of your farm business that is actually going to have a positive. I don't like the fact that, or I don't like the idea of having to pay for something that I think I can do naturally. So, what I mean by that is I'm a big fan and advocate of agroforestry. And I think willow has a huge role to play in this field. Coppice willow, there's trials actually been done about 20 minutes from me at the minute, where cattle are being fed coppice willow. And the idea is that the as it stands, because a sort of long story short, to give you a bit of context, it was originally for biomass purposes, but the market has went out from that, so it's now being used as a trial field for recording methane emissions of cattle that are grazing it, and the tannins within the likes of willow and multi-species swards and things like that there have huge potential to reduce the methane output of ruminants while at the same time having positive effects on your soil, and positive effects on your bottom line, on the financials of your system. That's sort of where I stand at it at the minute, to be honest with you. We'll probably get on to it at the minute, but I also think that the methane issue is over egged. And there's not enough knowledge around the methane issue. There's a lot of shouting around it, but not enough knowledge. That's maybe a question we can explore as well if you want.
Yeah, let's go into that because it does feel sometimes as if, especially I guess with social media, that narratives can get going very, very quickly. So suddenly everybody kind of knows that methane comes from cattle, that's bad, therefore cattle are bad. But it's a much more nuanced debate than that, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
why do you think that's a problem, Jonny? I mean, there's a lot of disagreement and confusion about the warming effect of methane from livestock, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose everything comes back to carbon dioxide, and everything is compared to carbon dioxide. And as a result, I've heard this term coined quite a bit, and I completely agree with it. We have got carbon tunnel vision. So we're focusing on carbon as this evil entity, that we must remove from all business. Forgetting, of course, that you and I are made of carbon. Everything that we touch is carbon. Carbon is the single biggest thing in the universe. It's the building block of everything. Now, whenever you compare carbon dioxide to methane on a purely emissions basis, methane is a lot worse. Methane is I can't remember the figure, 200 times more damaging than carbon dioxide off the top of my head, or something like that. However, the way it reacts in the atmosphere is completely different. So carbon dioxide is a long-lived gas, methane is a short-lived gas. It's cyclical. Everything is cyclical. It just cycles a lot quicker than carbon dioxide. So the methane that is emitted from a cow today will be cycled within 10 to 12 years. So what that basically means is if you have a steady cattle population in the country, as we have roughly had from 1990, certainly in Northern Ireland, and although the trend is now for a wee bit of a decrease, I think that probably will continue. But if we have a steady trend of cattle population, that means that over that period of time, the methane has had little to no effect. Um, so the output emissions of the ruminants aren't actually a major contributor over the course of the cycle of the gas. Now, if you took it at a snapshot and said, you have so many cattle at the moment, they're a huge polluter because of the amount of methane they put out, you'd be correct. But if you looked at it in 10, 12 years' time when that methane is cycled, you actually realize that it's just part of a natural cycle and that it isn't as much of an issue as being made out. Now, I've done a couple of carbon audits on the farm here. A bit of context, we don't spread any fertilizer. We've reduced our meal to, well, it was nothing until a month ago, but that is a very nuanced reason that we had to buy a wee tiny bit of meal. And we'd use very little diesel. So the only real wiggle room that I have for reducing my output of emissions is through methane. But my emissions are incredibly low. But it's expected that I should have to try and almost starve a way forward into the cattle to reduce the methane in order to make any headway on a budget sheet, which I think is a wee bit silly. So yeah, it's as far as I'm concerned, yes, there is issues within emissions from the agricultural sector, but the methane one has been over-egged because it's seen as an easy win. Because if you reduce the number of cattle, all of a sudden you've taken out a whole block of emissions. But it's not fully realized how that gas operates in the atmosphere.
Yeah. Our this I often get frustrated that farmers get lumped together, and as we've kind of already discovering from this conversation that every farm is so different, every system's different. And do you think that meat and dairy, particularly from pasture-based production, are they undervalued by government and consumers, Jonny?
Hugely, hugely. Um, it's not even just from the emissions sort of standpoint. It's from the density standpoint.
Mm.
I mean, we have a huge crisis. One of the biggest crises in the country at the moment is to do with national health. It's not necessarily the National Health Service, it's just national health. I think I read a stat somewhere, was it 85% of the diseases that are currently going through the NHS are chronic inflammation diseases, all related to poor diet, poor exercise. Um, and that's not just in the UK, that's a Western trend. Um, and I think we can talk about that sort of conversation where do we need to eat less meat and dairy, or is it just that we need to eat better meat and dairy? Um, are we going to try and feed, like I'll talk more from my sort of aspect of beef. Are we going to try and feed people a food substance, or are we going to try and feed people something that is actively good for their health and will benefit them in the long run? And I think that has to be one of the major talking points within farming across the next few years. Do we follow the line of, with regards to beef feedlots, heavy intensive feeding, so you end up with an animal that is on paper quick to finish, large yield, but the nutrient density of that animal is poor compared to an animal that is raised more naturally, has a natural diet, is allowed to exercise, and create something that is a superfood, genuinely a superfood, compared to something that is just a substance. Um, so yeah, I think it's massively undervalued by government. I honestly don't think that anybody fully understands it. I mean, a lot of this stuff is coming out in recent times, in recent years. It's not something that has been pushed or has maybe necessarily needed to have been pushed. This is the realization of maybe where we are as a nation or as a society. um, where we need to actually be looking and spending our time and our money and our efforts on. Um, and I do think better quality food has to come to the fore of that. And understanding, I mean, we're a nation who's overfed and undernourished. I mean, that's quite simply put. And food value does not command the importance that it should, I think, in a household budget. And that maybe sounds a bit judgmental from me, but food is almost seen as something you just go and get. It's not actually, you don't think about it. You don't think about, well, how am I going to nourish my children? And how am I going to bring them up so that they're healthy? As a general trend, that's not exclusive, but it seems to be that food is just seen uh, long-term sort of medicine, and I think food should be seen as medicine,
Hmm.
a natural medicine. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
How much meat and dairy do you eat, Ruth? I've got four kids, we sort of, it's expensive feeding your family. I mean, it's a difficult one, isn't it, Johnny? You're trying to get sort of nice, healthy, nutritious, high
yeah,
quality food into your kids, and it is expensive, isn't it? It's difficult for all families, whatever situation you're
yeah.
in. But Ruth, I mean, where do you tend to shop in supermarkets? Do you try and buy from other farmers a bit? How do you balance that?
I think just going back to your point about the cost, I think there's that, but there's also the convenience as well.
Yeah,
People are busy with
yeah,
with
Yeah,
lots of different pressures on day-to-day life. And yeah, I do my weekly shop in a supermarket in my local town of Melton Mowbray because it's convenient.
mm,
I know through the work I do here at Clawson that that supermarket has high standards. And they have high standards from the sustainability perspective, but also from animal welfare as well, particularly with their British producers, because I know what we have to show them when we do our own audits with that supermarket chain. So I think, I buy a lot of product from there. I don't eat meat every day of the week. That's not a conscious choice. It's just doesn't always happen. But my evening meals are things that don't always have meat in them. Certainly when I've got friends over, that might be the occasion when I decide, okay, I'm going to go all out. I'll go to, there's a really lovely butcher's in Melton Mowbray, and I will go and splash the cash and buy a really good joint. And that is locally sourced beef, lamb, predominantly what I get from there. Dairy side of it, yeah, I'm probably a bit too addicted to dairy, so have milk straight out the tank at home, which is quite nice. A nice bit of raw milk for breakfast.
don't blame you.
We have
lovely.
three of our suppliers here at Clawson. They also use a bit of their milk to make other dairy products. So get yogurts from local farm, Manor Farm yogurts. They're fantastic. Another one produces really delicious ice cream, and another one produces other dairy products, including cream. So I tend to be a bit more fussy over where my dairy products come from, actually. And working in a cheese manufacturing factory, then I have the choice of some delicious cheeses from Clawson, literally on my doorstep. So I am spoilt for choice.
Yeah, yeah, I don't blame you at all. Johnny, have you had sort of conversations with other farmers and friends and family members? Have you found that other people are trying to eat maybe a bit less meat but better quality, or what kind of?
um, I suppose we have a bit of a cluster group here in Northern Ireland, um, and a lot of people in there are direct marketers and sellers. Um, so it's quite interesting to have conversations with them around this space. The Personally, where I'm a very fortunate position where we have our own grass-fed beef, and I'm able to slaughter animals and stick them in the freezer, and that's fantastic. It's a wee bit like what Ruth was saying. She can be fussy with the dairy. I can be very fussy with the red meat, but um, I'd be very keen to put uh, try and diversify my food plate, shall we say, with things that I can make myself. So I've often procrastinated about putting in a veg block and growing own veg here because I think some of the most disappointing things can be your veg and fruit from supermarkets and stuff.
And I think, aren't we individuals that want to go and sort of suggest you should be buying all your meat from the butchers, for example? What a privileged position to be in to be able to say,
Mm,
if that ends up being the norm for those that can afford it, you're actually advocating for a two-tier food system
yeah.
where, if you can afford it, yes, you can have access to products that have got a really good environmental footprint, really high animal welfare standards. But actually, if you live in a really deprived area
Hi
of one
guys.
of our cities in the UK,
Mm,
yeah, we don't care where your food comes from, actually. You can get your chicken from Thailand or Brazil,
yeah.
as
Yeah.
long as we're okay and we're ticking those boxes. A lot of finger pointing is often done at the supermarkets for having a really negative impact on our food systems, but actually, it can also be a really good force for good. I've certainly had my eyes opened over the last 2 years working here at Clawson in my role, as to what goes on behind the scenes at some of our major UK supermarkets and the standards that they have and the standards that they keep evolving, keep pushing on. And you don't see that publicly at
Mm,
all, but you can go into one of those retailers and feel confident as a consumer that those products have been raised or produced to the best of that farmer's ability, and that farmer's hopefully been paid a decent amount for that. That's
yeah.
very idealistic, but they've got the power to do that anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Johnny, we were just saying that for a lot of people, it is difficult to buy healthy, high quality, nutritious food, isn't it? Because a
Yeah,
lot of people just can't afford it. I
yeah,
live not very far from a town with a lot of social problems and a lot of unemployment, and it's difficult to access that, isn't there? And Ruth just mentioned the danger of there's this sort of two-tier system where where
yeah,
where
yeah,
the
yeah.
how do we get beyond that?
Yeah, it is difficult because there's so much demand on a person's wallet. It's not just as simple as saying, oh, well, if they really value their health, they go out and try and source all the best food they can. But as
Yeah,
you say, it's not that easy. I mean, there's people that have no access to even a car.
yeah,
They can't go and find this stuff, and they have been, people have been educated to think a spade is a spade and a fillet steak is a fillet steak, or a liter of milk is a liter of milk. It's sort of, and people aren't going to spend an awful lot of time worrying about things like that if they've got much more immediate demands on their time and their money. Um, so I mean, and it's very hard for a retailer to go and do something about it because at the end of the day, they're in the business to make profit.
mhm,
It's not necessarily up to them to control the quality, or it's not necessarily up to them to control what people eat, or how they eat it, or when they eat, or how what sort of food they have access to. They're going to sell people what they want, and you can, at the end of the day, it's a business model. You can understand that, but I think there has to be some sort of top down from the government approach to this, where they have to look at it and say, well, we're spending so much money here on a failing health service. Do we just continue to try and put bandages and plasters on broken legs, or do we actually go and we find out what's breaking the leg in the first place?
mhm.
And I think it has to come, whether it's even into like school meals, that they really, really not force, but they really fund good quality food to go into school meals, hospital meals, things that they have a bit of control over, they can start on, and then maybe that gets the ball rolling, and it gets into the debate of should there be incentives to buy good quality food and disincentives to buy poor quality food or ultra processed food or high sugar foods. Um, and I mean, that's a debate for maybe another time, but it's going to involve hard questions and hard decisions, and it's going to involve people that have to look beyond the next vote,
Yeah.
unfortunately, as a politician. And that's probably the most difficult thing to find is a politician that's willing to look past that. Basically give themselves a resignation. But yeah, that's sort of where I would.
It is difficult, isn't it? Because if you look at the sort of the premise of this podcast and this conversation, what should we be all eating less meat and dairy? You could make a very good argument nutritionally and in terms of children's growth rates and things, they probably should be eating more dairy,
More,
milk.
yeah.
Milk, for example, a lot of countries, I know in India they've got very ambitious targets about getting milk into all children, all school children in India,
Hmm.
in a nation of 1 billion people, and yet in the West, often we're talking about reducing it.
Yeah,
It really is a very difficult thing, isn't it, Ruth?
yeah, yeah.
You're a dairy farmer. You must even have this internal debate sometimes. It's hard, isn't it?
It is hard. I think sitting here, I just keep going back to the comment that Johnny made a little while ago, comparing UK supermarkets and the layout versus a French supermarket.
Yeah.
So much of the food in our site is ultra processed.
Hmm.
And even if you consume the same level of meat and dairy, but say you cooked from scratch
Mm.
and you lowered your salt intake or your sugar intake, then that should, in theory, have a really positive impact on your health.
Mm.
But, cooking from scratch, people are time poor.
Yeah.
And, 20, 30 years ago, typically it would have been the woman in the household who'd have done that. Well, he's saying that women should go part-time so they can, or not
Yeah.
saying women, but if we really advocated for that, I think it would be typically women who would find themselves doing more of
Yeah.
that legwork. I'm being very generalistic here, but maybe our society and the way we live today has it's gone beyond that.
Mm. Yeah.
I don't I don't I don't like the thought of everyone living off microwave meals. I try not to myself, but that's a conscious decision I've made to spend more time batch cooking at the weekend with a freezer. But not everyone has that luxury of time.
No. Not everyone has a freezer, do they? As
Not
you
everyone has a
mentioned it.
freezer, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
It's
For sure. And
Hmm.
and yeah, the
Yeah.
comment Johnny made, like,
yeah.
cooking in school. I had cookery lessons when I was growing up in school and at home.
Mm.
I know how to
Yeah.
feed myself and other people.
Yeah.
Not everyone has that either
Hmm.
anymore.
No. No.
Well, I think
But
home economics is not in the curriculum now, if I'm right. It's not
Wow,
mandatory.
that's
mm.
crazy.
I heard that somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, I'd love
But
to be proved wrong on that, but I think it's like cooking and nutrition is not seen as a valuable spend of your time.
mm,
More money's made
Um,
out of ultra processed foods for sure.
that's right.
well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we've established that this is a huge issue and very, very difficult. So I'll ask this question to both of you. What's one thing that you've read or watched or listened to recently that you would recommend to listeners who are interested in getting into more of this topic, Ruth?
So the first one was I was able to get to a screening of a new documentary called World Without Cows that a company called Alltech have put together. So at the moment you have to contact them to get a screening, but they're going around the country. They're doing screenings for young farmers clubs, for example.
Okay.
So I'd highly recommend looking at that. It was a sort of 90-minute long, real insight into the impact that cattle have, positive and negative. It was really balanced around the world. And then listening wise, I've also had been able to listen to a chap called Jack Bobo at a couple of conferences
Mm,
I've been to recently. He is an academic who's now based at the University of California in Los Angeles, but was at Nottingham University until last year. And he has a really fascinating spin on the journey that our sector has been on over the past 30 years, and continues to go on. And I just love the fact that a lot of it's around how we tell our story and not bombarding people with stats, but actually let's get to the heart of our story as a sector and how we can change things and have a positive impact on the climate change crisis that we find ourselves in.
yeah, yeah. I've seen it. Jack speak before as well. He's very good, isn't he? Very entertaining as well.
Yeah, yeah, very good.
Jonny, what about you?
I've got two rival podcasts. Can I mention them without being shot?
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Well, the first one is the Grounded podcast, the Regen podcast by
Mm.
Stuart and Kyle, and they had a guest on called Dr. Lucy Williamson, and she was talking about gut health and how it's connected to good soil health, and how we are more connected than we ever actually think to what we eat, how we eat, where it comes from. It was fascinating, and she started out actually as a vet and went into human nutrition. So I don't know how you want to take that sort of segue in career, but she went from the animals to humans. So. And then the second one was on the Regen Ag Chat with Liz Jennifer and I can't remember the second one. It's on the tip of my tongue, but anyway, the guest was Dr. David Unwin, and he was fascinating. He was talking about reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes through the diet. And he himself had actually managed to reverse his own type 2 diabetes purely through diet. And he was a medical practitioner who was deeply challenged by a woman coming into his practice one day, because he lined up to give this woman a big telling off for um, missing appointments or something like that there. And she walked in, and he was fully expecting this woman to be a picture of unhealthiness. And she walked in, and his jaw nearly hit the floor because she had reduced so much weight, and she just got herself into a real mode of health, and she was absolutely fantastic. And he basically got the rundown from her, and she ended up criticizing him for his way that he was approaching her healthcare, and it completely changed his
Mhm.
view on healthcare. And he went for a big deep dive into diet and exercise and how that benefited everything. So he's now become a bit of an expert in type 2 diabetes and how to reduce the risk of it. Fascinating. I would recommend both of those fascinating sort of listens, so they are.
Okay. Brilliant. All right, that's all we have time for this week. But thank you so much for joining us, Ruth Grice and Jonny Blair. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back very soon with another episode of We Need to Talk About Farming.